Center for Latin American Studies from Harvard. Welcome to webinar 13 on the Academic Forum for the New Constitution in Chile. Due to the elections of new constituent councilors, processing results and reflecting on what is the path to follow, this forum has been performed by DRCLAS, especially our regional office in Santiago, in the Andes Cano Sur program. Before we could begin, I would appreciate and thank our three panel members and moderator, Verónica Figueroa Huencho, also Marcela Renteria, who is the executive director and our office of the region in Chile and the main motor behind this forum. I would like to thank Christian Rodriguez, also our business scholar in DRCLAS, and the DRCLAS team, Dene Barra and Marcela Ramos. Thank you. It's been around 3 years DRCLAS created the forum to offer a platform for an open debate and a high caliber critical conversation about what is happening in Chile to designing their constitution. The idea is to put together the academia in the international forum with political and social participants in Chile with different points of view and political views. We have had a consultative council with 7 professors of very well-renowned in Chile: Claudio Fuentes, Claudia Hayes, Juan Pablo Lunes, Cristian Rodriguez, Sol Serrano, Sebastián Soto, and Verónica Figueroa. Several local institutions in Chile supported the forum, including the Government Department of Universidad Chile, Instituto Milenio, Fundamentos de los Datos, Laboratorio Constitucional, Universidad Diego Portales, Law Department of Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, Instituto de Ciencias Políticas of PUC, Government School, and we are really thankful for all your cooperation. Very briefly, we will start again this forum because the constitutional change is important and it could be very positive and necessary for the democracy, especially in these days where the level of lack of public trust to the democratic institutions has been raising all over the world practically. But the image of the constitutional change in Latin America has been strongly affected by the Chavista model, where one populist strength or force was proposing a constitution in a unilateral way with a very lack of democracy objectives. But there are other paths for constitutions, and we thought since the beginning that Chile, with the democratic tradition and political consensus norms and strong institutionality, could have been the new model for the constitutional reform in Latin America. And the Chilean path has been different from what we expected. We clearly are in a new world, and the level of mistrust, public mistrust to the political elite is high in the clouds, and the level of influence and power is in the floor. So the first lesson for the Constituent Assembly was appalling triumph of the anti-system left, but the leaders of the new assembly in the majority were in the novice stage, and they had a poor calculation, thinking that everything changed and none of the rules of the history in the politics and how severe it was part of data that they needed no consensus with the center or the wing, and the winds of history were within, and it was a wrong mistake. And eventually, I think they have gone through one of the very incredible situations against themselves, as they had an opportunity for a sustainable change and they totally failed, unfortunately. Paradoxically, today, anti-systemic right has got another appalling success. And to understand what has happened, what's happening, and what could happen in the months to come, we have organized this webinar, which will go in Spanish, If you don't realize, I'm trying to use my Spanish in this communication. We will have simultaneous interpretation into English. If you'd like to listen into English, you can click in the globe sign on the lower side of the screen. You can send questions to our panel members at any stage in the webinar, but please use the Q&A function, not to chat, please. The forum will take 90 minutes with one 15-minute presentation of our international guest, the wonderful Manuel Jose Cepeda, followed by 10 minutes presentations of the local academia, and then your questions. It is now the time for our moderator, Verónica Figueroa, who will introduce the panel members. It's a brief presentation, Verónica. Verónica is professor in the Faculty of Government, Department of Government in Universidad de Chile, and she's been working in the implementation of indigenous public policies in equity, and also a very relevant subject today of plurinationality and democracy. Dr. Figueroa published a wonderful number of academic articles and the wonderful book, Acumulación de Políticas Públicas Indígenas en Chile, Evidencia de un Fracaso Sostenido. She was Luksic Scholar in 2019-2020, just before the pandemic, Undersecretary of Higher Education in 2022-2023, and has been part of our consultative members. Thank you, Verónica, and we give you the best regards from Cambridge.
Thank you, Steve, for your introduction. And yes, of course, we are here again in this important webinar to talk once again about the constitutional process in Chile. This is a process that is currently going on, and with the new members of the Constitutional Council and the constitution makers, 62% rejected the previous constitution project, and that opened up a new constitutional attempt, and a new committee of experts began drafting a work in a pre-project March this year. This pre-project that was finished and rendered presented yesterday will be the base of discussion of the Constitution Council. They were chosen 50 members in parity. It is important to point out the composition of that council with a majority right wing, 23 councillors for the Republican Party, 11 of the Chile Vamos coalition, both right wing, and they leave a council with a minority of the left wing representatives, as well as a space for indigenous communities. It is important to point out that in this process, the search of dialogue and the search of consensus will be very important. And even though the Republican majority has manifested that it's going to be a one unique group, well, they might be looking for points of agreement, and negotiation will be key. I was pointing out that we have this pre-project that will start being discussed the first week of June, and the project resulting from this constitutional will be December 17 this year. And what we will be looking for is the answer of a question. Do you agree or disagree with the new project? Yes or no? What are the challenges? What are the possible routes, the possible paths, challenges, gaps? What are we going to face in this process? And this is what we're going to do. We're going to focus in this webinar. We will be talking about that with great group of professionals and scholars. First, we will be opening with Manuel José Cepeda. Manuel José Cepeda is a Colombian jurist. He was member of the Higher Council of Los Andes University in Bogotá, Colombia, and also in the Max Planck Institute in Heidelberg, fellow, and will tell us about the process of reform a constitution in Colombia. His presentation will be commented by wonderful speakers that will analyze the presentation from the point of view of Chile. We have María Cristina Escudero. She's a doctor, a professor of the Faculty of Government of Universidad de Chile. She's an editor of Revista Política and also a counsel of the Electoral Service in Chile. We have Gabriel Negretto. He is a political science director and also in the doctorate of political science in Catholic University, affiliate professor of political studies division in the Center of Research and Teaching in Economics in CIDE, Mexico. And we also have Julieta Suárez-Cao, and a joint professor in political science, under director in political science in Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. And she is one of the coordinators of the network of political analysts, women political analysts. And as Steve said, please send your questions through the questions chat, and we would like to ask the presenters to stick to the time given. Professor Cepeda, you have 15 minutes for your presentation. Thank you very much, Veronica. I would like to greet Steve, Marcela, and of course, my partners today. It is a great pleasure for me to be here. I wish you the best from Colombia, and in this case, from Max Planck in Heidelberg. We hope the best for Chile and our Chilean brothers and sisters. I will not talk about Chile, of course. Now, I will not talk about the experience. I will only talk about the experience that I have in Colombia, political, juridical, personal. I would not dare to comment the process in Chile. I will talk about the Colombian experience, thinking about the current situation, what is going on in Chile. And I will not talk about the whole constitutional process in Colombia. This started in January 88 and July 88, and then constitution was approved in 91. 3 years and a half with elections, presidential elections, with the very difficult times, with many issues, many bumps in the road, and it was not easy. It was not easy. We reached July 4th with a new constitution. I will not talk about the new process. I will focus on three main questions. How was expectations? How were they managed? What happened with the stronger agreements? And how we reached a consensus? And the expectations in Colombia, expectations of the constitutional process, paradoxically could be qualified as high, low, and impossible. High in the sense of the fact that citizens wanted a major change. And that led to a number of participative processes, and citizens met around work tables and workshops around the country, and they were dreaming with a new constitution or a new constitution that would change things for good. And all that was sent to the Constitutional Assembly. And there were many actors in opposition the political parties, former presidents of the Republic. And we had another level with the attorneys, how these were points were brought down. They were brought down to earth. Expectations focused on two main issues. First, security, organized crime, narco-terrorism. Remember that Colombia had active guerrillas. They were all active guerrilla members and guerrilla movements, plus narco-terrorism, the Cali cartel, Pablo Escobar active, and the challenge of crime to the democratic institutions was high. People needed peace, safety, security, and we moved forward on this. And something that could be interesting for the issue of agreement. A general or national prosecutor's office was created, but not as the American style. So it was a Mexican prosecutor, general prosecutor's office. Now, even though we had representative of the former guerrilla movements, decided not to talk about the military forces. And that was identical were the military forces and the guerrilla that affected the activity of the military of the army. Well, this doesn't mean that there was no transformation of the army. There was, but that came later. Then, peace instruments, so as to continue negotiating with the guerrilla. And thanks to the constitutional process, new groups signed the peace. And once the siege was closed, as creating exception state, and this is something that we're going to talk about. Well, the people wanted politics to be done differently, wanted to have politicians as people expected, but this was not successful. I mean, they have not reached that. And there's a number of regulation on the political parties, access to the media, a deep reform. At the beginning, it worked, and bipartisan worked, and then the way of doing this and corruption continued with different modalities, and it did work. The later control work, and many Congress members of Colombia, they have been condemned in court. I might say 50 after the new constitution. And the Council of the State is a judiciary entity. They take away the all the benefits the Congress member can have. There is a change of expectation, and there also social, cultural, and multiculturalism. And well, it was mentioned, but they didn't talk about a constitutional court, the principle of what is a social state of right, privatization. So the system was not so complete. And these issues were presented by the government. And finally, paradoxically, there were no expectations of adopting a new constitution. And the rules of the Constitutional Assembly, they were talking about a reform of the Constitution, but the government agreed on creating a new constitution, and that's how it worked. And then impossible issues where the details that were looking, different sectors were looking for. Presidential counselor, and also from the President Gaviria, the University of Los Andes came with a whole team of researchers. And in the Palacio Nariño, there was an issue in security. Why so many people coming to talk to you? But so many people, 30 people were coming. And it was a whole group from the university. They wanted all this research and background to do a sort of a genetic review or analysis to this, and in 40 articles. And I said, well, why? Because it's important, because this is important. And I would like to tell you why if there are things that are not said or presented in the new constitution, it will not exist. No, it's not. No, it's not. Constitution, this is not covering each and every detail. It's only giving us the rules or the rules of engagement or the rules of the game. So there were, yes, in the articles, some impossible expectations were there.
How did we handle the expectations? The government that had a very important leadership, that's the first characteristic in the Colombian process. It was promoted by presidents of the Republican governments that wanted a change, and they kept the leadership despite of the Constituent Assembly declaring themselves sovereign. No problem. It was tense, but they found a way. I will mention that soon. The expectations, while time went by, went down, and when they had some hindrances in the rules, the ones that were promoted NGOs, they said they put us out. We're not there anymore. This is not going to work. So there was a need to keep high expectations to one sense, that it was going to be a change, and the government tried to do it in different mechanisms. But at the same time, the expectations needed control and being channeled. And that was done, as Professor Negretto we were talking before starting the seminar. There was Cesar Gaviria promoting with all the political forces of the Congress to reject violence, basically all except for the Communist Party at that stage. Then the agreement was the agenda fixation of some subjects to be dealt with. So before the election, it was known where the change was going to be applied. They were long negotiations, hours and hours, nights and nights. We went through several times in the conversations from one day to the other to write the agenda, but that would allow channeling expectations in a direction that was shared by different political forces represented in Congress. We didn't know if they were going to be the same that will be represented in the Constituent Assembly. And of course they were not, but it was an advantage to give calm and peace on the agenda, that the Supreme Court was not fearing approving the process, so we were able to continue. And we were advantageous about giving orientation to the country in a theme discussion that was agitated from the government, creating committees and commissions of experts, and it was discussed and the results were published. There was all this debate to move this theme before the Constituent Assembly election. When it was elected, the problem was managing expectations, going from one project presented by two constituent members that wanted to go back to the Constitution of 1886 without reforms, just as it was adopted in 19th century by a very conservative government. And on the other hand, partial projects and some projects of new constitutions, but in fractions. Facing that, what the government did was proposing that discussions could be more grounded in the text. How doing this in the context that the political intention of positions and things to be said could go to the precise text that was organized in the following way: in the rule of the assembly, done by the assembly, with some government influence. The first stage, they decided, let's don't talk about articles, talk about political positions. Each member of the assembly was able in the general debate to show their position. But then they said, discourses stop here, general discourse about political positions. Now we need to ground it into the text. And the theme commissions were created to gather different propositions. They listened to the discourse and they wrote texts, sometimes very contradictory, to be honest, poorly written, if you want, but they were grounded. Texts were grounded. The texts were taken into the plenary for debate. And when there was one subject that was difficult to deal with, what was done was pluralist accidental commissions. That is to say, the ones that were going for one sense or the other, they got representatives on the accidental commission where the government had participation, sometimes a minister of a government, sometimes myself as counselor or advisor of the presidency, and discussed the detail of the text. And once that was finished, was taken back to the plenary. If it didn't have followers, well, again, a commission, accidental commission. So there were trials and trials once and again. And I will refer back to the exception state. Exception state finished and Colombia was governed by states. So the states of exception were created. But what was the limitation? We tried for the first time with one draft. It was not accepted. Then second text, not accepted, not even in voting. So under this state of emergency or state of exception, a commission, accidental commission, dealt with the subject, and I will tell you how the solutions were made when there was no agreement. But the government had an important paper. They had voice on the Ministry of Interior, not the President of the Republic, no voice. As a presidential advisory, I had no voice, no minister at all, except for the government conceding the word. So the role of the government was low, but facilitating when there was hindrances and major difficulties. And that was the way in which the expectations were handled, but also lack of agreement when it was deep. So let's go for these states of emergency or states of exception when we are on an emergency rule, just to mention the variations and saying something that could be of your interest. The essential thing was working the text into the detail so the different positions can feel or could feel that way they were interpreted, and the result in the proposed text was a long text, right? Really, really long text, 3 articles, but they were extensive, but with a very interesting formula that very difficult subjects were in a new invented figure, which is the ley estatutaria. The instrument was created to send a decision about missing subjects where there were no agreements. If we have agreement, back to the Congress. For the future, where was not agreed, it is not the ordinary law or the Congress, but the Congress via a special law with qualified majorities, with a faster procedure, more demanding, and with previous control of the Constitutional Court. So in Colombia, exception situations are under the statutory law. But the opposite mechanism of participation, there were no ways to even arrive to a long text where you can add different positions of different political positions. It was just writing them. In the participation mechanisms, there's popular initiative, plebiscite, consultation, and they said a statutory act or law will regulate this matter. Then we have two extreme. Another key point was the attitude on different agreements that were deep disagreements. Government could have created majorities with the Liberal Party and Alianza Democrática. And to flatten, we call it, to use flattening politically, we say that in Colombia. And it was decided not to do any flattening if we have votes. It's different. It's a constitution. So this will last. It is not to be changed. Something that we could say it was adopted without winners or losers in the rhetoric that celebrates the Constitution of 1991. We said it is important for Colombia as it was the first in the history of Colombia without winners or losers. It's part of the constitutional legend, but it was the result of the attitude of not flattening anyone, listening to others, trying to include them. And of course, eventually we have to vote. And in the voting, the division was deep. But eventually, we decided not to accept the initiatives that were going on their own when a member of the assembly proposed something because of just thinking about it. And it was a good idea, but it was not going through the processes mentioned. That was denied. They could say many good things or subjects where the initiatives, if you're isolated, it's a no. You need to follow a process. To finish, I know I am my time, but how can we say some examples? I would highlight two things. We accepted that in the Constitution, there will be rules that will stress others or contradictory to others internally, especially in economic matters. And that was the decision. And eventually the political process will do the conciliation and working with a vision of the future, never going back to the past, never criticizing how many things you can criticize in Colombia that we still can criticize. But how can we make a future that is good and shared for everyone? These were the additional elements operating to get to a consensus. I know I'm out of time. I wanted to add some aspect that happened after that, but if we have the opportunity during the Q&A, with pleasure, I'll do that. Thank you very much. Thank you, Manuel Jose. This is a very interesting presentation, similarities and differences to what we have seen in the first part of the Constitutional Assembly in Chile that could be what we could arrive to in the consensus and how we manage the expectations. Not much to say. Panel members maybe have lots of things to say and reflect upon. We remember to each of you, we have 10 minutes for reflections. We will start by Dr. Maria Cristina Escudero. Maria Cristina, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Verónica, and thank you for the invitation. And thank you also, my co-panel members, for being enthusiastic to make reflections on what's coming in the Chilean situation, in the constituent process. I was listening to Manuel Jose Cepeda's words, and I was not able to compare to this process that was not fruitful, which just finished. But I would love to view into the future to think what happens with the recent elections and the way in which our Constitutional Council is made of, we can make reflections and parallels with the Colombian process. I would say first that the first difference is the pluralism that's present in the Constituent Assembly in Colombia, which was made in a very different way compared to the bipartisanship that you had, exceeding the traditional parties, including the guerrilla that were part of politics, and from that generating dialogue. So I ask myself, who should be members of a constitutional assembly, as we can consider it is a constitutional assembly? Chile, in the process that just went through this deliberation, had the same problem, and we will have the same problem. In the convention, we had a deliberation body that was anti-establishment, get to the left, non-negotiators with the center and the right, which is very different from what Manuel Jose just mentioned in regards to the Colombian Constitutional Assembly. Even if we have the votes, we will talk about rules that will be transcendent and go beyond contingency, without losers, without winners in a new constitution. Somewhat that was not achieved in the Constitutional Assembly. And we have to see what happened. I will just mention some pieces of data. If you're not Chilean and you're listening to us, to give you context, the Constitutional Council is 25 and 25 members in parity, where the extreme right and right have 2/3 of the assembly, which is the most demanding quorum in the procedure to reject norms that come from the Commission of Experts, that draft that we will need to rule upon. And with no social diversity compared to the last convention that was politically inclined and biased to some sector, at least socially, it was diverse. In this case, the characteristics is not being socially diverse, but traditional parties are the members, and maybe lots of new faces, but from political parties, with an inclination to the right, where I would not bet that the attitude of not being able of using the power they have because of the sector that is part of it, a sector in the majority of these 2/3 has never wanted a new constitution. Consequently, if the draft comes from the committee of experts, which is sober, I would say sober, especially in regards to the proposition that came out of the last constitutional convention, I think it continues to be a lot to digest for the sector to analyze it. So from that point of view, crossing the street, as this is a sector that was built upon a base of a very acute critique to the left and the way to handle government, and antagonistic, I think that plurality and the civic friendship that we need in a constituent assembly, it's difficult, so to say. And I would not bet on anything, as there's political feelings and sense to show government capacity, as they have the presidential commission or territorial commission in the elections for municipalities that could moderate positions. But that is something to be seen. But we're lacking on how this was made of. We could have some flattening here that could ignore fully the text that comes from the Commission of Experts. Then I thought of the role of the executive in the constituent in Latin America with positive and negative values. But in Colombia, it was articulating, and in the Chilean case, it has not been, never, so far. Maybe with Bachelet, we had some possibilities, but it was a process that never finished.
However, with the second try, it started with Piñera's government that was very complicated. With the process, he didn't go to the opening, the formal opening, and then Boric government. It arrives in a complicated time where they cannot link to the traditional policy and the convention. We have this situation again. We have a constitutional council that is constituted majorly in 2/3 by the opposition. And the government is displaced again. We are not in a moment where it will have an articulating role. And also the seeing this from the front and invited to talk. And I would like to mention participation, citizens' participation. Citizens' participation is very interesting, and but they're not linked to the constituents, the constitution makers. There were many participation mechanisms, and due to different reasons, it was not so. And the citizens, well, were left out of the discussion. And now we have an opportunity, and the opportunity is citizens that don't see with great expectations. At the beginning, they had great expectations without having clear the subjects. As in the Colombian case, they mentioned peace and a new policy, a new way of doing politics. And yes, this might be an issue, but there were no specific concrete subjects in this process, even less. And the participation push towards that could be positive, well, as a tool, is a bit broken down. And we need to see that we will have some mechanisms of participation, and maybe the citizens will be involved. I would leave this here and leave for the questions, further comments. Thank you very much, Maria Cristina. Thank you for the challenge, attention on pluralism and what's coming, participation, dialogue, interest of the citizens, and would like to for the floor to Gabriel Negretto. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I would like to point out some of the points of the constituent process in Chile that contrast the case of Colombia and also many other cases in Latin America as well as around the world. The constituent process in Chile, failed process in Chile, is unique in many aspects. First, demanding conditions from citizens' participation. Participation at the beginning to decide if there's going to be constitution or not, an election, direct election, involvement, citizens' involvement in the process, sending proposals. And in this sense, we have comparisons with Latin America, extensive comparisons, in cases where there was an anti-model, in the case of Chile, and the process was led by an hegemonic model and authoritarian centralist character of the approval of a constitution, as in the case of Bolivia, Ecuador. And in the case of Chile, it was pluralist, highly participative. In the case of Colombia, was not participative. It had an informal referendum and then to start the process, however, did not have a referendum and gave 26% of the voters participated in that case. And if we consider that compared to the Chilean process, participation was very low, was not 45%, less participative in our case. And during the participation in the elaboration of the text was very scarce, was very low. Now, in consensus, in terms of the consensus and the elites, two-thirds of the members, most of the cases in Colombia, most of the cases in Latin America, most of the cases, they were approved by absolute majority. And Colombia, there was a will from the political parties to reach a consensus. And this was approved by the majority. And the consensus was achieved. Well, we need to see the interaction, the rules, what was assigned, the effects, unexpected effects, and also the elections and the lists, changes in the midst of the process, and also the factors, poor performance of in the constitution. Well, we have with the Colombia and other processes. Constitutional process in Chile was a process without parties, without the leadership of the parties. And as Dr. Cepeda mentioned, the Colombian case, considering the automation of the case, and it's a disaggregated process, and was a process that was a party process. In Chile, it was atomized. It was individualized. It was with individualities, with poor structuring, and that constituted a part of the problem. And not only to approve certain standards, but to reach a social consensus. Now, regarding the political issues as well, we achieved only 20% of the votes when they had more than double, and they had the double of representation, 27% in the constitutional process, and a higher percentage in the Congress back then. So the right wing comes down due to the rejection the right wing had with the constitutional change, and many people that did not agree with the process, and they did not participate. Repercussion of the process of what is happening now and comparison. In certain aspects, The process is an inverted mirror. A limited number, limitations, 12 points, and a draft made by an experts committee that will have the power of an agenda, and 2/3, not 3/5, and they have a power of an agenda in this experts committee and also an admissibility committee in the approval standards. Now, on the side of the election of the progress, and this is a specific issue that we are discussing, there is certain continuity. There is certain continuity and 62% and incorporated in mandatory vote. They vote against, 62% go in favor of the party, and that are looking for minimum changes. So we don't know the combination between the incumbent and ideologic vote. When they voted in the convention in 2021, well, there is more than one factor to control: voluntary vote and a government that opposed the constitutional change and that had back then low approval. Now, today it's being voted with mandatory vote with over 80% of the electorate compared to the previous election, and that are voting per party, and parties that are as coalitions that historically opposed to the constitutional change, but then go for the constitutional change that should be minimum or moderate in what they expect. Ironically, and I would say that, and also concluding, under these conditions, the possibility of approving the Constitution increases. Why? Well, because if the Republican Party acts in a strategic way, this is the only party that is operating in the Constitutional Council, and it's the only party that has operated in both processes. This has been the only, as Sartori has mentioned, and it's a traditional party. It's not a coalition. So if they behave strategically, what is going to show is that they're going to show consensual with dialogue and with the liberal right, center right, operating, moving in a minimum way, making not much noise in the public debate. And that was key to incorporate all those that were not part of the political discussion. Minimum approval. And that is how they end up as the savior or of the taking Chile out of this labyrinth. And they would have a contrary image compared to what it should have as an ultra-right wing, or in some aspects, and other parties in the region. Thank you. Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you very much. This is very interesting participation, consensus, and the whole role of the Republican Party, and that is having a role in this discussion agenda. Julieta. Thank you. Thank you. Very happy to be able to talk to you about these issues. I wanted to talk about this current process. The current process is opposed to the previous process. It is opposed due to the different reasons that Gabriel was saying. The way it was elected, how the mechanisms acted against the control of the parties, and reducing the reserved seats. If they did not arrive by vote, maybe today we wouldn't have had any representative of the indigenous people, and they do not compete list, but they are part of, had to become candidates. And I think this is the one that challenges the least, and they all compete inside the list. And this is quite interesting. The same with the 12 constitutional bases. We don't have this blank paper. There are some that are general. We have had a public discussion as the social state of right, and they say that it's complementary to a subsidiary state. And for me, the greatest or the largest question here, beyond a rejection, a final rejection, is how the technical admissibility committee will work. Because the process is so close that it will allow that with a fifth of the vote, they could be taken. A fifth, it's not many votes. These rules could be taken and in the technical committee of admissibility. And this generates questions. And it has the possibility of preventive control that they're going to exist there. The threat that this might exist, well, it would lead to the fact of seeing, well, what are the dynamics there that are going to be working there? And also the results that we have seen, incumbents vote, ideologic vote, and I coincide that we need to see the impact these effects would have. And I would like to add something else that we have not discussed, and that is the results of May 7. Beyond ideologic results, these are part of electorate of opinion. This was not on large constitutional projects. This was not as what we had in 2021 of social rights, etc. These are issues that are there, that are within the Constitution. In this case, it was the election was based on the opinion on security, and that has to do with public policy, contingent public policy, with an impact. If we see the surveys, the survey of December 2022, when people point out what is the greatest problem the government should tackle, 60% mention safety or security rather. And then they mention health, education, and pension fund system. So I don't see that there is an ideological block there. And that is, there is, yes, they voted for the right-wing party and that are related to the international networks that fund these type of parties. And 2021 and leaving the UN, etc., and others. And in spite of all that, I wouldn't go that far saying that 36% of the people that voted for the Republican Party are people that have an ideology in line with them or conservative, ultra-right or conservative. These changes that are pendular in some cases and in Chilean politics, but they have to do with the agenda of the time of the election, the picture, the image, what was going on. And I think this is good, and it talks about the Chilean democracy, and it leaves us with a more optimistic horizon. Not thinking that there is a 36% of people that support ultra-right in Chile. Beyond ideology, beyond the incumbent, there is an electorate, an opinion that have differences of opinion in safety, in security, in social rights, and they will move, they will vote in accordance to their needs. And we can take lessons from that, lessons that might be too dramatic. For instance, saying that we're losing the core. If we say the metric center of people represented in the constitutional process is a UDI party, is a right wing. And that might give us the impression that all the options, specifically in central left and central right, that they did not do very well in the elections, they disappeared. They disappeared in the Chilean environment, and that leaves us in a polarization. I think, and I would like to think rather, I'm paraphrasing Donald, I think this is thoughtful vision and not wishful thinking. And we hope that the options have failed in Chile, that the right-wing options have definitely failed. And how they are going to work, and I agree with Gabriel. I think that the draft or the pre-project or the draft that was presented yesterday has enabling conditions that might not be so digestible for the ultra right or extreme right. And we need to see how they're going to work on that. See if they're going to modify and take out some clauses or annul some clauses, others that might be considered more ideologic, and disassembling some of the things that were from the experts commission. So I agree that Jose Antonio Cast is has its survival at stake here as a leader of the opposition. And 36% of the votes, and to win a presidential election, he needs to overcome, he needs to obtain an absolute majority. We need to see how they end up. Where will they be ending up? And also these changes in the constitution, if they could be replicated in regular elections. And lastly, thinking that, well, yes, they're a party with a leadership, with a strong leadership. We need to keep in mind that Congress, where they have representation, part of these parties and senators, they have been against any type of change in the constitution. They have called to vote against the result of the new process. And we need to see what is the control Jose Antonio Cast has over his party, taking his troop and move forward and see if we're going to have some figures within the Constitutional Assembly moving to the side. And well, I have more questions than answers. And well, this might be a good point to continue talking.
Thank you, Julieta. Very interesting to ask questions about what comes next and the role of the far extremism when we debate a new constitution. We have questions for you and questions that could help assemble this puzzle of what could be the pieces that are key to assure that a process that the one we had in last 2022, and how can we make progress in consensus, complying with expectations, participation, and a process where citizens feel called. In this is the line of some of the questions. I will be asking the questions, but I'll ask the four of you, if you want, you can choose the ones you feel more comfortable to provide us with some reflection. One has to do, as you mentioned, and Julieta just said, with the draft. We already have a draft, which somewhat is a draft generating high consensus. The first question is this draft, it seems to be a lot more moderate than the previous one for 2022. Will that moderation stay when the draft is discussed, despite the majority that the ultra-conservative sectors have in the Constitutional Council? How can we get a constitution that is also with moderation, plural, and no risk for the majorities? That's one of the first questions. The other interesting question has to do with something that particularly to me is of my concern, which is the political participation, especially of the sectors that not necessarily are represented in this space. And you well said, Maria Cristina also touched upon this, political diversity versus social diversity and cultural diversity. In this constitutional council where you have majority of the far right politics and or right wing extremists that they say that they don't share uh, laws that are linked to women, LGBTQ plus, or indigenous populations and First Nations. How can we make that these diverse voices that are part of the Chilean society could mobilize their own agenda to have these under discussion? The other interesting question has to do as something with you already mentioned with different participants in the processes, as it was mentioned by Manuel Jose and Gabriel, especially about the participation. They think about communications and what is the role of the means of communication as we have seen it in the fake news in social media or lack of information or the lack of interest at a certain stage in the discussion of the Commission of Experts. And also to see the Colombian case, the role to favor or to obstruct a plural discussion. And to close with a question that I think is interesting that has to do with keys, three keys mentioned by Manuel Jose. What are the three keys for the process to continue in this constitutional council could be successful? If you think so, you have a word in just the same order in which we presented. I will start by Manuel Jose. The floor is yours. Your microphone, please. Okay. Can you hear me now? Thank you. Very briefly, as there's a couple of questions that are very specific about Chilean situation, and I would not deal with that. But I would refer to the participation and other media of communications media, the non-represented, as Professor Negretto said, in Colombia, we tried to have rules of elections so as to have plurality, a great plurality of the ones that were not part of the Congress. So we could say that in Colombia, the Constituent Assembly had everything of everything. We have farmers, they were not elected, indigenous people, poets, they were different people, so on and so forth, and they were part of the parties, but also with the double condition of representing something else that was not just their political party. There was mechanisms for listening at different stages of the process. They were these mechanisms, and the trade unions created their working table. They had propositions, and that was sent to the Constituent Assembly. just like the unions, the non-governmental organizations, they were part of this, but while deliberating, the members of the assembly were the ones in control. In the communication media, always favoring change. Very few communications media opposed to the process. They were accompanying, they were promoting, they were assisting and helping in difficult situations where we thought it will fail or stumble. There was transmission directly of deliberations. Some were very attractive, some were very boring. People wouldn't hear that, but you can have access directly, and they were uh, permanent situations for information about it, and the media was part of accompanying the process. Once it was adopted and approved, there were so many campaigns in the communications media to promote it with the support of the communications media themselves. Even at the level of votes, the informal voting that was at the same stage, which was called Séptima Papeleta, was uh, announced by the journalism, by the media, written media, and the second voting was electoral organization to distribute cards with the text, not of the basis, but the basic principles to be respected. The text said to strengthen democracy and participation, I vote for a constituent assembly that is pluralist, representative, and so forth, following the elements in a very brief. We had no basis that could tie in this process. That's my very specific question. Some elements I did not refer to. There's a book that was recently published to celebrate 30 years of Constitution. Maybe it could be in the chat. You can download it freely, and you have explained details of some aspects I could not refer before. Thank you very much. Thank you, Manuel Jose. We have added that book. It's very important. Maria Cristina, the floor is yours now. Maria Cristina, are you there? If not, while we reconnect with Maria Cristina, Gabriel, please. Okay, I'm there. In regards to that question, what I think about social legitimacy of a process that could be with less participation, despite of the fact that they have participation channels, I think that part of the experience and the lessons of the failure of a proposition that was rejected is that the public debate, when there's conflict, when you see clauses that appear and reform and innovation changes that proposed, I mean, foster division, especially for the right that was not able to block, and the rest of the convention, which had no group to try to incorporate them. I think that communications media were in charge of amplifying to some major extent the conflict or debate. Plus, the excess of advertising in the ways, attitudes, words, and actions that were totally out of the conventional participation that eroded the image of the Constitutional Convention compared to a process that is aiming now almost not to be secret, but with some limited advertising now. And I think it's part of something that we could analyze in opposition to the process, and I think it is intentional and is by design. And certainly, taking into consideration the uncertainty that the um, constituents create and the lack of interest of the constitutional change today, taking into consideration what happened since 2019 up to these days, I don't think it's a poor idea that the political leaders and the parties that are looking for these limited advertising, they are not totally wrong, I would say, in the sense that I don't see propositions that could create huge social support or great rejection. I think this will stay as moderated reforms that minimally are shown like progress made upon what's existing, even if it is a small progress, generating not much noise in the public debate that was really overloading the previous debate. And to generalize with the comparisons of Colombia process, which I followed in some cases, studies that I followed, even following the written press, they were totally different. You had consensus in the journals favoring the process and the need of change in the newspapers. If we need to change it in Chile, the communications media were a lot against the process, if not very much against. They were looking for the amplification, especially of problems, conflicts. But I think that the members of the convention, with excess of advertising and lack of moderation, they in a way caused and make this feasible. Thank you, Gabriel, for the answer. We already have Maria Cristina back, and I'd like to uh, have questions. If you have votes or opinions in a constitutional reform, if you think gender, indigenous population, sexual diversity, and opinions that show about what the vote represents that is so marked to the right, and you have referred to it when presenting and commenting. Maria Cristina, the floor is yours. Thank you, Veronica. Struggling with technology here. I will be in charge of the first three questions that appear. Unfortunately, in the constituent processes, we have no magic wand. In all the constituent processes, we have seen different situations, and we need to locate ourselves in the context. I'd say that it will depend a lot on how moderate the constitutional debate is in the expectations, especially if the Republican Party to predict themselves as a party that is able to establish dialogue and govern. In that, if we have an ambition and a good strategy to create concessions, start deliberating, not imposing extreme positions, I think we can have a possibility for a more moderate path. But it's true that the political entities participate with incentive, but these incentives are not always the more rational ones. If you have any ideological um, position and you are supported by the recent voting, that could uh, play a part for the Republican to extreme positions, something that happened to the last convention, like a schism in the last convention. And for the ones that think they don't have a voice, the key is in the ability of organization to affect the process. The individual actors maybe not having much of
might
incidents.
not have such a great incidence, and the organizations that achieve articulation, they should use the mechanism so as to achieve a contingent, an adhesion contingency. And this path is not easy. As we have commented in the panel, the process is structured in such a way that protects itself and not maintaining control. And political parties thought that they were going to have an equivalent, and it did not happen. This goes against those that fostered this type of mechanism and this opportunity. I will go to the 3 keys of the process, and this goes in line with what we were talking about. The keys of the process here are in the traditional right. What is the role the traditional right will play? And the Republican party is a party that is very strong, and the right wing in Renovación Nacional, and those in the institutions, if they play an articulating role or not, that is the question. It will be based on what the Republican Party establishes, and it's a bridge, and it doesn't have that center that it uses as a bridge. So that center moved. It moved in its ideologic radio and radius, and it has negotiated with the Socialist Party and for decades. So if they do that, and if they generate that bridge, it is key. There is a role for the government, that feels a bit away from the constitutional process, and the citizens are a bit skeptic, and they have a process that is far from the process beyond the social unrest and the protests that we had. And it will go beyond that. It will go beyond that. There has been a void, a lack of information regarding the fact of where should we focus when we make a new constitution, and what is the access of the political system, what is the access of the fundamental rights, what is the social and democratic status, right status. And this is something that we have to discuss. There is a void there. Mass media, well, there is interference. And in Chile, communications, the need is marked by political trends. And we also have a social network that do have an influence in the media. And the government has, well, there's certain skepticism against the government that they can play a role and foster this participation, the participation needed to legitimize. So it could be close to the constitutional process. And I agree with what Gabriel was saying at the right wing. If they play a good role, they can become, and they can take the title of carrying forward a good constitutional project and to have an act as in a more articulate way. Thank you, María Cristina. Julieta?
Elegir también algunas preguntas.
And I wanted to choose some questions. Stephanie's asking how the marginalized groups, historically marginalized group, can do in the political process in Chile so as to participate in a constitutional process. I see this very difficult. I see it difficult, well, in issues of right and dissident and sexual diversity, indigenous people. Well, and the indigenous people, well, it was installed that the plurinationality was to blame, but that will be very difficult to put on the table again and to put these subjects on the table again. Now, in the sexogeneric differences, well, this is contrary to different types of recognition. And the central left and the left, they are focused on identity agendas. And I think that's how the opportunity window was closed, having an important impact. And women, well, the issue of women, well, we have, I work on this, and my impression is that this descriptive representation parity that we have in these institutions and experts commission and the Constitutional Council will move forward in the rights of women. And this is strategic in a representation of women. And most probable is that we're not seeing things that are so relevant in the text. And is it sufficient? And in some issues that might have a better chance in terms of the rights of care, violence, gender violence, and in the axis, left and right axis, and it's very complicated to carry out. So what these groups will do is to go to the Congress, continue working with the government that is open to on these issues. Three strategic keys here will be after seeing the process, after it finishes successfully. And these are the ones that we have considered as the major errors from the previous process, and a process that is less outgoing, and we can fail in different areas, and that will be seen in the next meeting. We will start analyzing the three causes and the applications of success or failure. And on the question of Marcelo Gavarossi, what does this represent? So inclined to the right. Well, it represents incumbents, the previous process, why people rejected the draft the first time. Well, it was due to the way the convention behaved. Secondly, because it was going to divide the country. As Gabriel was saying, this is not so much on the text, but how this was bought. I mean, from the text, from the media from the social network that it was going to divide the country. And there is a rejection towards how this process was carried out. And I am convinced that the electorate, they voted Republican due to issues regarding security, but they do want better pensions and access to public health that Republicans will not offer. So we are in the midst of this hurricane, and we need to separate things before we give a satisfactory answer. Thank you, Julieta. And I would like to thank the whole panel for the comments, reactions, challenges, what's coming. And I would like to offer the floor to Stephen so he can close this wonderful webinar. Thank you, Veronica. There has been a world trend, decades in the 20th century with a broader conception and what are rights. And there was a belief that Chile was not only going to follow that trend, and we thought that an expansion was necessary, constitutional rights in Chile, so as to respond to the mistrust and unhappiness. And what's probable is that we will have a constitution, and it will be a constitution that will be more liberal in the classical sense, considering the 20th century, and for good or for bad, and we will see the consequences. I would like to thank the professors Figueroa, Cepeda, Negretto, each and every one of you for your interest in participating. And I would like to invite you to our next forum that will be at the end of 2023 after the referendum to see if Chile has a new constitution or not. Thank you so much for your participation. Thank you. Thank you.